Good afternoon or evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for our conversation on pose. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that there will be a Q&A portion near the end of this event. If you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you will see a number of icons, and you are welcome to type your question into the Q&A section, and our moderator will do their best to present it to the panelists when the time comes. Speaking of moderators, it is my pleasure to introduce ours today. Dino Ray Ramos is an LA-based editor at Deadline Hollywood, where he writes about diversity and inclusion, as well as advocacy and impact in film and TV. He is the creator and co-host of Deadline's New Hollywood podcast and was recently honored on Gold House's A100 list, which honors the most impactful Asians and Asian American and Pacific Islanders in culture. Welcome, Dino. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Q&A with Pose. We have the lovely EP, Steven Canals of Pose. Hello, Steven. And the co-EP, Janet Mock.
Hi.
And unfortunately, Our Lady J wasn't able to join us. She had some personal matters to tend to, but of course, we send our love to her as usual. But Steven and Janet are here, and we're so happy to have you. And the audience just recently watched the Never Knew Love Like This Before episode. But before we get into that, how have y'all been? That's a question we've asked ourselves, and we have, we know the answer already, but how are you surviving right now, Steven?
By baking.
We just talked about this.
Yes. There's been a lot of baking. This has been a period of time where I am so grateful to have technology and to have the privilege to, have a computer and to have a phone that has the ability to, chat with friends through whether it's Zoom or FaceTime. And so that's been a really lovely way to stay connected to friends and to family. Because I think this period of time, I think a lot of folks have been feeling very disconnected. And that's been tough, especially on the heels of, the protests, and finally seeing, real allyship coming from all areas when it comes to the relationship that the Black community has to law enforcement, and the conversations that we're now having about the prison industrial complex and not only defunding police, but also abolishing prisons, I think is really wonderful. And so it's been great to feel connected and to utilize technology.
And Janet, how have you been surviving?
I think similar to Steven, I've been surviving by staying informed, by seeking out, I have my text chains and all my different people that I check up on, making sure that they're good. I think having that accountability with the people that I love has helped me feel purposeful in this moment. And I think I'm, completely energized sometimes by the things that I see online, by the decades and decades of organizing that has happened to the point that now we don't have to defend saying Black Lives Matter. People get that. And now we're on the next most radical point of it, which is defunding the police, right? And realizing that all of our interactions are not the same with the police based on our skin color, right? And realizing that Black and brown people are disproportionately affected by, policing, surveillance, incarceration, and violence, of course. And so speaking the name of George Floyd just as much as we speak, Breonna Taylor's and Nina Pop's and, Tony McDade's, realizing that this work is intersectional. And I think that what's so great and grounding in this time period is that I get to work with someone I love, Steven, and we get to help shape a show and retool things and think about things in different ways for our next season of Pose. And we get to do a show that's impactful and purposeful. And I think that at the end of the day, it feels as if we're contributing in our way of culture change.
Yes, yes. Well, speaking of the show, by the way, you guys look fabulous. And
You
with
do
our
too.
with our carefully curated backgrounds, my prince is in the background looking at me, if you could see.
Love it.
You know, with the latest season of Pose, you know, the first season was just so groundbreaking, and it was so, you know, inspirational, and told a story that's you know, seldom looked at. I mean, the LGBT community, TQ community knows of the ballroom culture, but so you had this introduction with the first season, but now with the second season, how did you want to take it to the next level? Or, you know, I mean, I know that's always used, but how did you want to elevate? How did you want to add on to the story or this foundation you built? Steven, we could start with you.
Sure. You know, we have a really small writer's room. It's Janet and I, Ryan Murphy, Brad Falchuk, and Our Lady J. And the same 5 individuals have been working on this show since the beginning, which is wonderful. And it creates a shorthand for communication. And in similar to the House of Evangelista, we've sort of become our own home, which is lovely. So at the end of the first season, we had a text chain, we had an email thread, you know, and so we were constantly in communication with one another, throwing out ideas around what we wanted to do for season 2. The thing that Ryan said early on during season 1 that I think was really important is laying the groundwork for our audience to fall in love with these characters. You know, let's bring them into the world. Let's have them be part of the conversation. Season 2, we can then look at taking much bigger swings narratively, because by then we have an investment. And so going into the second season, we knew that we wanted our politics to be up front and center. And they're certainly, you know, threaded out throughout our first season. But I think our second season, we went in with something really critically important to say. You know, we had just come off of a number of specifically Black trans women being killed. So going into the room for season 2, we knew that that was a conversation that we certainly wanted to engage our audience in. There was a New York Times article that was published about Hart Island, which obviously impacts our season 2 premiere. And so again, we knew that there was a conversation there to be had around the discarding of LGBTQ people, and specifically their bodies, in the midst of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And so all this to say that we went in full throttle. You know, we knew exactly what our intention and what our purpose was with our second season.
And Janet?
And, you know, just, yeah, I agree with, you know, Steven's not lying, he's telling the truth. And so.
Thanks, girl.
You're not lying.
You know, you have to be careful with that one. No, you know, I think that with season 2, it was just all about going deeper into the world. I think that season 1, of course, was to introduce the people to the world and to realize that, you know, most of the audience watching aren't just LGBTQ people. You're reaching out to a global audience. And so to get them to invite and spend time with and to love and cry and cheer on trans and queer people of color in this magnificent way was a great triumph of season 1. And I think with season 2, we wanted to say, okay, you love these people, right? Now let's be accountable to them, right? And so like, these are the things that actually happened to them. Not that bad things didn't happen in season 1, of course they did, but I think that the depth of the emotions and the journey of the visions were grander and bigger. You know, for instance, we spent months breaking Blanca's story. What is the Blanca and then therefore the House of Evangelista story? Because the whole series is based on our heroine. She's our singular heroine in that sense. And so for us, it was like, what does Blanca want, you know? And so when we knew we were going to do this time jump to include Madonna's Vogue being released and how that shifted and changed the scene, that gave us a way in to say, well, Blanca would have bigger visions because of this mainstreaming of their previously niche underground space. And then with Pray Tell, we always knew very early on that he was going to be our activist. We wanted to kind of do a revisionist history in a sense to say, what if ACT UP had been this inclusive, had included trans and queer voices of color to be at the center of organizing. And so, and therefore with the season premiere, acting up, you know, we anchor it in that activism, as Steven was saying. And so we have the activism and we have the dreams of like being a part of a mainstream culture, which were the two kind of pillars for us that helped us go through the entire season.
And, you know, the episode the audience just watched, Never Knew Love Like This Before, is you know, I saw it as this kind of shift with the show in a good, you know, in terms of storytelling, in terms of, you know, what's going on in our world right now. And I know, I think I talked to Jana about this before, about Candy, and how like when I watched the first time, I was all, oh, this isn't real. Yeah, like this is just something that they're doing, and you know, they're gonna fast forward and she's gonna be okay. But no, you know, and I said, you know, but she had so much story to tell, so much more story to tell. And I remember Janet, you telling me, it's like, oh, that's exactly what we were trying to say. But with this certain episode, did you see it kind of as a turning point, or as a different, as a change of course for the show? Janet, I guess we could start with you this time. Yeah.
Maybe not so much a change of course, but it definitely it became this great jewel that was also an obstacle for us. Mm-hmm. Because it happens kind of smack dab in the first half of the season. You know, we got a bigger series order of 10 episodes compared to our 8 in the first season. And so as writer producers, we were thinking, okay, what kinds of stories do we want to tell? How can we fill this out? We can go deeper in everyone's lives. We knew new relationships would be going on between the characters. So we knew we had places to go. But I think after Candy passed, you know, we really wrote 1 through 4 as a unit. Like it was like 1 through 4, we spent months breaking that and just kind of like going back and rewriting and retooling and debating on whose life would it be, you know, who would we be losing in episode 4, which was already a hard thing to even think about. And so just all of that stuff, I think for us, we thought so much and spent so much time working on 1 through 4 that we were like, oh shit, we have to follow up Candy's death with more show, like more. And so I think that was, and I let Steven jump in here too, but like that was, I feel like the hardest thing for us was like getting back on course. And I feel, you know, from a critical standpoint, that we got back on course from episode, you know, 7 until 10. And really when Steven picked up the mantle and wrote and directed Revelations, which was our episode 8, which was his directorial debut, that I think really put us back on to like, this is what the show is about. Like we've grieved for 3 or 4 episodes. Now it's about life, you know? And so we went back into that. It's about life. It's about family. It's about the complicatedness of their relationships, being held accountable to one another and forcing one another to be their better selves.
Yeah, Steven, you want to add?
Yeah, I think, you know, I want to add to what Janice said, which is the conversation around trans deaths and how we do or don't value as a culture trans lives is one that we have been steeped in since the very beginning of our show. And we'd had conversations as a room about death and dying for our characters, obviously at the very beginning, because we knew that our characters were going to be dealing with HIV/AIDS, but also, you know, the disproportionate amount of violence that trans women face, specifically Black trans women. So we didn't come to the decision to lose one of our characters, one of our principal characters, lightly. There were, as Janet said, months and months and months discussing those first 4 episodes, because I think we all just had so many complicated feelings around making that decision and doing it in a way that was not only going to honor Candy and all of the Black trans women who we've lost and the Black trans women who we continue to love, but in a way that would speak to our audience and hopefully open up their hearts and force them to do more, you know, to not sit idly by and just be a spectator to what's happening, but actually to be engaged with hopefully a movement. So it was a lot, as Janet said, and I think, you know, I think we all just needed a break after the 4th episode. You know, it was taxing. It was really emotionally exhausting for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, oh, Oh, sorry, go on, Janet.
Oh no, and I was gonna just piggyback. It just, there was this great thing about that episode, even to this day, getting messages, and I'm sure Steven gets them as well, but it's the messages you hear from people who are deeply grieving a Black trans woman dying, which in a way that when trans women off screen are dying, you don't get that same outpouring of grief outside of, maybe some Black or Latinx, queer and trans spaces, or just from trans people in general. And so in that sense, there is a magnetism and a great power of that episode, in the sense that it became kind of a calling card, because we have someone that people have fallen in love with who actually uttered the first line in the pilot of Pose in season 1, who's been there from the very first frame and beginning, who you now have loved and laughed at and been like, girl, bye, what are you doing? Like all of your antics. And then you see her leave and you're like, wait, I don't know anything about Candy. I need to know more about her. And when I remember the conversation we had last year, and you were just like, yeah, there is that sense of like, there's so much more for Candy. And it's like, exactly, there's so much more for these women. There's so much more. They had, all these colors, they had all these complicatedness, all these sharp edges, all of these things that were being blunted and softened through love and family and community, just like Candy. And so these women are just like her, except she gets to have an hour dedicated to her life and her love and all the things that she wanted to happen in a way that most people will never get. And so in that sense, that episode became a memoriam or of sorts to all of those folk who fallen because of that kind of, hatred and ignorance and violence.
Yeah, I think that the episode just handled it so well, because it's so often we see members, this whole, killing and, tragedy of the LGBTQ community. And I only could imagine how you guys tried to, like you said, it was taxing, because you had to navigate that space to make it not that, but, also a celebration of life and bringing truth to the screen. But the titular episode, the title, it's and how we see her celebrated at the end was just done in this way that I haven't seen before. And believe me, Candy is throughout the rest of the season. She's very much present, even when she's not on screen. Did you want her, how did you want her to live on throughout the rest of the season? Oh, anyone who wants to answer.
Oh,
Steven. Steven or Janet. I'm all staring at you.
No, for us, yeah, it was like she was a ghostly figure. She was a hole in the show and in the family unit. I think, the fact that we can, for audiences, they would know that she grew up in a house with Blanca. She grew up as Electra's daughter, that she was, Angel's sister. And specifically Lulu's ride or die, and so when you see, there is something about seeing Lulu on screen and not seeing Candy there, that there is a hole, because they've always been paired as, this dynamic duo who's always scheming and plotting and trying to get something done, and so in that sense, you feel that hole. And I think that we were purposeful after 1 through 4, that we were like, okay, we need a breath, so let's do a palate cleanser. Let's do an episode centered on the boys dancing, so we have Ricky and Damon and doing their thing. And then, 6 was like our musical cabaret episode. And so we were like, okay, now we got to get back to reality with, 7 through 10. But they were purposeful palate cleansers for the audience, because I think it was a lot to take in. It was a lot to grapple with. The whole episode was heavy up until the end when she lip syncs. As her final goodbye and kind of bow and farewell to her community. And so, yeah, and then of course her literally coming back as a ghost in episode 6 is its own thing.
Which I just want to add too, I think the other thing that's important to know is this has always been something I've been heavily critical of on television, which is, I understand you'll have an actor connected to a particular character. And so if that person leaves the show, it's hard to have them return. But the reality is, when you lose people, they don't just suddenly stop existing for you. You continue to, and especially in the case of Candy, if there's a terrible tragedy attached to that death, you know, that person continues to be a presence in your life, and you continue to think about them, and you probably wrestle with, you know, the truths of their final moments. And so that was really important for us to honor that, because I think, you know, again, to think about the ways in which we as a culture deal with trans deaths in this country, you know, as Janet pointed out earlier, you know, Tony McDade was a Black trans man who was murdered. And, you know, it's like, why are we not talking about that death? You know, there are plenty of trans people who continue to face violence and discrimination, and it just doesn't get the same type of attention that their cisgender counterparts get. And so again, for us, we just wanted to make sure that the audience knew that it wasn't about bringing Angelica back for the sake of having her back. We love her and we love the character of Candy, but for us, it was just a reminder to the audience that these individuals continue to live, you know, in the people who knew them. And so we have to remember to continue to honor those lives.
Yeah. You know, and I'm so glad you put that front and center, because it's far too often, like, I felt like I had to dig to find information about Nina Pop, because that really, I mean, it just wasn't brought to our attention unless you subscribe to a feed from, you know, The Advocate or Out Magazine or any, you know, GLAAD. But, you know, I think what you guys do with this, what this episode speaks so much to what's going on now. And speaking to that, you know, Pose is this kind of epitome of inclusive storytelling and in this landscape where we are in now, and we do need it more now than ever. But, you know, how do you think it speaks to the current landscape? You know, you've touched on it already with Nina and Tony, and especially with LGBTQ narratives in Hollywood and people who, you know, try to define what trans identity is when they shouldn't really be. And I know you probably know who I'm talking about, but how do you think the show, specifically this episode, can speak to or be like, I don't want, like, I guess a cautionary tale or a learning tool for people right now? Whoever wants to chime in.
You know, my good friend and mentor, Neil Landau, coined the phrase, niche is the new mainstream. And I think one of the things that was drilled into my brain when I was working on my MFA in screenwriting was that we need to be culturally specific, especially in this golden age of television. And so, you know, I think what is so important for us is to lean all the way into the truths of what it means to live in the intersection of queer and trans and Black and Latinx. You know, that is really truly what we are honoring on our show, outside of themes around, you know, family and resilience, et cetera. You know, recently I was honored to share the cover with, you know, Miss Janet Mock. The Hollywood Reporter had their, you know, first 50 most powerful people, LGBT.
It's our competitor, but that's okay.
You know, we're not gonna throw any shade.
It's all love.
Where's your list, Dino? Where's your list? But I bring that up because, you know, I don't know if you had talked to me even 5 years ago, I could have ever imagined a world where two people like myself and Janet would be included on that list, you know. And I think the power of, you know, Janet, who I've known and admired and loved from afar, her work as an author and as an activist and as a talk show host, and now as a writer, director, producer on multiple series, the first Black trans woman to ever write and direct a series, you know, on TV, and to be the first to now have an overall deal over at Netflix. Like, that is incredible. Like, that is amazing. And so we truly are living embodiments of our forebears' greatest dream, you know, like we are what they hoped for, you know. And so I think what's so important, and the thing that I want to say is that we just have to remember that, you know, there are so many folks who are still living on the margins, and they just want to know that their voices matter and that they have value. And we have this privilege to create content and to put that messaging out into the world. And so we cannot be an afterthought. You know, we aren't just a trend. The reality is that for Janet and I, as Black and brown, queer and trans people, like, that is our lived reality every single day, as it is for our cast and for many of our crew. And so it behooves us, it's so critically important that we continue to create narratives that center those lives, you know, and that when we go in to pitch new content, that is taken as seriously and given as much value as our white, straight, cis counterparts.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the great things of working on Pose is that it was my introduction into the industry. It literally is my film school. And so in a sense, I am a little spoiled by my experience working on Pose. I get to work on a show that, you know, on the call sheet, you see trans actors playing trans characters. You see out gay men as the leading men, a Black out gay man as the leading man. You get to see, you know, department heads and, you know, gaffers and grips and drivers who look like me and talk like me and are corralling our background actors, you know, our PAs and our, you know, assistant directors and all of these people that it's just like, oh my God, this is how every set is. And every set, I've now learned, is not like that, right? And so a part of the commitment that I make, not only in the characters that I will create and continue to write and direct and all that good stuff, putting them on screen, is also to make sure that our crews, our writers, our directors, that they represent that. You know, we're so grateful to, you know, I am so grateful personally and indebted to Steven, because, you know, he never gave up on this idea for Pose that almost every television executive in town said, no, it's, you know, I don't think no one's going to watch it, And then grateful to Ryan Murphy to say yes. And then they incubated the idea and then said, well, you know what, we should probably get some great, you know, unknown trans women to color this world and to really contribute and to check us and to make it deeper and And they recruited, you know, Our Lady J from Transparent and then me. And it's just been this great collaboration to have that. And I wish that more shows were like that. I wish that more showrunners and co-creators had that thought to realize, I don't know it all because I didn't necessarily live it. And so if I'm going to choose to engage in a world that I do not know fully, then maybe I should get some co-conspirators to come in on this and to, you know, send that elevator back down and bring them up, right? And to say, here's your first shot. You deserve to be on the show. And that's what Pose did. And I really do believe in Ryan's, you know, kind of mission that, you know, using show running as advocacy to say, these are my people, they have different point of views. Let me, you know, champion them. Let me in the season 2, give them the show. In season 3, they're going to write and direct almost all of the episodes, you know, and that's the kind of, I think, great mentoring and inclusivity. When we say inclusivity and diversity, the action behind it, right? It's not just enough to have someone on screen. You also, as a producer, have to really think critically about who you're going to have on as your collaborators. Because it's easy to go get the most famous choreographer, the white choreographer in the world to do all of your dance sequences. But it's another thing to say, you know what, there's someone within the ballroom community. There's a trans woman and a Latinx cis woman who should be choreographing all those ballroom scenes. That would be fresh. That would be new. And therefore now they're doing this work, right? And so I think that just thinking more creatively about what inclusion actually looks like on your production sheets.
Yeah, and I think that just speaks to the, I mean, we always say that, you know, we always see the hashtag representation matters, but, you know, when we see stories told by our community that reflect us, it makes us feel good, it makes us feel seen, and it's authentic storytelling. And also, in a lot of cases, it sells. And I think, you know, we are in this interesting time, you know, going to what you just said, Janet, we are in this interesting time with the pandemic, with these protests, and we are slowly seeing this interesting reckoning happening across the board in all these industries when it comes to racial inequality and, you know, underrepresentation, and voices are speaking up. So with that in mind, how do you think what's going on right now, you know, outside the window, out, you know, the protests, I think there's a protest going on right now as we speak. And this pandemic where we're all just kind of incubating and locked in, how do you think the world's going to shift, you know, after we are safely to come out on the other side of this? Steven, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I think we're beginning to see that shift. You know, there are conversations that I think folks of color, both Black and non-Black, have been engaged in for quite some time, you know, and I'm hopeful. You know, I see the conversations that are happening around defunding police, for example. I know there's been a lot of conversation around abolition. My partner is an abolitionist, so we talk about it all the time. And I think for the first time, I think in the 4 years that we've known each other, it seems like that conversation is now happening across the country. And so I feel really good about that, to know that, you know, we are talking about the ways that the prison industrial complex disproportionately disenfranchises Black and brown people in this country. How that will impact story, you know, I will say from the perspective of Pose, the politics of our show have always been up front and center. You know, from the very beginning, we were tackling issues around race and class and gender, and we'll continue to do that. You know, we obviously can draw parallels between the HIV/AIDS epidemic and our current global pandemic, you know, especially when we really dig in and look at statistics and who is being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So obviously, you know, it's all baked into the DNA of what Pose is. You know, I hope, to go back to something I said earlier, I think in terms of the Hollywood at large, that this period of time will inspire the gatekeepers to really consider what their current slates are and what content they have. You know, that, as to Janet's point earlier, you know, referring to Pose as her version of film school, there are so many incredible Janets and Stevens out there who just need a chance, who just need an opportunity. And they aren't being given. You know, the Writers Guild of America West just put out a piece in the last, I think, week or so, and it has statistics or percentages of how many writers based on identity there are in the various writing levels. And so when you go from staff writer, which is your entry-level writing position, all the way up to showrunner, and you isolate that by race, for the most part, POC as an umbrella term, so people of color and their white counterparts, are pretty much on equal percentages right up until the supervising producer level. And then it just disproportionately shifts. And so from supervising producer all the way up to showrunner, the numbers are abysmal. So for executive producers and for showrunners, there are 81% are white compared to 19% for people of color. And so we can't have folks of color, we can't have women in those positions if we're A, not inviting them to have a seat at the table, and B, if we don't continue to allow them to move up the ranks and get to those levels. And so that's the kind of shift that I hope we start to see on the heel of these conversations.
And Janet, I mean, I know also, Janet, you were a journalist, and you're seeing, I don't know if you've been kind of monitoring what's going on in the world of journalism. You know, a lot of people are speaking up about, you know, this inequality in terms of, being mistreated. But, I think the Bon Appetit editor resigned, Refinery 29 resigned. And then there is this reckoning. And even, I'm going to say it, in the trade industry, things are going down. But, to that as well, like, how are you seeing things shift?
For me, I think what it's done is that it's forced us, like these protests and this activism and this organizing, what it's done, it has forced all of us to have these more critical conversations, not only about the system, the specific system around police brutality and police's engagement with communities of color, right? But we're talking about everyone's engagement with white supremacy and racist ideology, right? Racist ideas that are ingrained in systems across all industries, right? Why is it overwhelmingly that white people are in power, that white men are at the pinnacle of decision-making, who get to hold on to budgets and say what's greenlit and all of this stuff? And so I think that what it's going to do specifically for Hollywood is that it's going to force us to have, I think, deeper action based on these conversations, because we've been talking about this forever, right? Your work that you do at Deadline, you do this in a podcast, you talk about diversity inclusion. We've been talking about this stuff forever. And so now I think it's time that we realize that, for me, at least as a creator, I do not want to invest in a space, a studio, or in a project that doesn't necessarily center my very unique vision and value my voice and perspective in the world and the people that I want to surround myself with 12 hours a day on a set. And so I think in that sense, just on that very intimate level for myself, that's what it's done for me. It's realized, okay, you've done enough to survive now, sis. Like, now how are you actually going to make sure that you are living in a world that you actually want to engage in for the amount of time it takes to do these projects? These projects are long-staking projects before we even get on a set. And then you actually are on a set and then you're confronted and you're just like, oh my God, like, I am still the only in the room, and it's still strange and bizarre, and it's not the best place to be in. And so I think that it's forcing us to have deeper conversations that then lead to greater, I hope, action on an integral level, where it's like just really thinking about the person in the room and the creative in the room and how we're supporting that underrepresented or unconventional talent.
And before we move on, if you guys have any questions, please start submitting them now, and we will get to them, as many of them as possible. So if you have any questions, go down to that little question icon down there. I'm very smart, and submit your questions, and we will get to them. So I want to talk about the forthcoming season of Pose real quick. Can you just tell us what happens? or like, where do you see it going? And well, first off, were you guys already in production, and like, how far were you into production when the pandemic hit?
Well, Steven and I were we wrote the premiere together, and I was directing it, and then Steven was starting to already start directing parts of his episode where he wrote and directed episode 2. And so I was ready to hand off the baton. I was like, okay, it's your set, bye. And then, Miss Rona came, and
she was all, you guys, you can't do this no more.
She said, y'all got to stop. And, I will say proudly, for our production, we were the very last production in New York City, still going, largely because a lot of our work is on stage. So we kind of have that great convenience, being a period piece in this kind of way, you're limited to oftentimes to stage work. But we were about to start, we had our ball days, our ball sequences for the first 2 episodes lined up for that following Monday, and Thursday night or Friday night, we got shut down. And so then we kind of dispersed from there. And so I'll let Steven talk about what's happening in season 3.
Yeah, tell us. Wait, first off, is there another time jump? I'm not 100% sure. Or like, what can you tell us?
Yeah.
Who's coming?
So, yes, there is a time jump. There is a time jump. It's funny because I've talked about season 3 quite a bit, and I've always been very coy. And then earlier today, Janet just spilled all the tea, and I was like, "Oh, we're just gonna tell everybody everything." Oh, okay.
Okay, so what's going on? Who's hooking up? What are the guest stars?
My tea. I've been teasing. I'm like, well, you know, Miss Blanca may or may not find love this season. Janet's like, she finds love, and it's with Jeremy Pope.
Okay, well, Jeremy was on our podcast, so he told us that he was on the show. So that's not that's not a spoiler, is it? I don't think so.
I don't think anyone knew that he was playing her love interest, though.
Oh wait! Oh, breaking news! Deadline.
Yeah. So, well, there it is. Spilled it.
Blanca gets a man, basically. That's what happens. That's all of season 3.
The end.
But you can't. Can you tell us more about his character, or you want to kind of leave that?
No, we're gonna tease you.
Okay.
You know, we're gonna keep you in the dark on that. But what I will say about season 3 is that, especially coming off of season 2, which was, you know, really emotional and very political, and we saw the family, you know, if season 1 was about a family forming, you know, season 2 was about the dissolution of that family. And at the very end of season 2, in our finale, which Janet beautifully directed, you know, you see the family starting to come together, a new version of the family forming. And so season 3, I would say, the overall arc of season 3 is really about the ways that families show up for one another. You know, when the ish hits the fan, who are the people that you turn to? Who are the folks who really are just going to hold it down for you? You know, truly be your ride or die. And that, I think, is the simplest way to sort of synthesize what season 3 is all about. In addition to all the, you know, the shade and all the other fun stuff that you love about the show.
Of course, it wouldn't be Pose without shade. And then I don't know if you guys announced any guest stars or anything. Can you tell us, tease, is Grace Jones coming?
Oh, I wish. You know, my dream has always been that Grace Jones would play Dominique Jackson's
Electra.
mother.
Oh my God, we're gonna manifest that right now. Grace, if you're listening, I'm sure you are. Come on. We have some questions coming in. So from Karen H, how did the original vision of what you conceived for Pose change versus what finally was broadcast? Steven, I guess we could start with you.
The original draft of Pose I wrote at the very beginning of 2014. I was in the second year of my 3-year MFA program. And I wrote that original draft with the intention of it being either on Showtime or HBO. That was sort of the place I always imagined the show living. So it was very, very dark. And then I went through a couple of revisions. I know there's a version of the pilot that's circulated about the original pilot. Ooh. And I'm very anal retentive, and I'm constantly rejiggering things. And so, you know, there are multiple versions of it. I think the greatest way that it changed, because there are arcs in that original draft that we retained for the version of the pilot that our audience has seen. But I would say the greatest way that it changed was, so early on in the process of rewriting the pilot, and this was prior to us bringing Janet Mock and Our Lady J into the writer's room. Brad, Ryan, and I had spent time talking about what that pilot should look like and how it should set up, you know, the arcs and the threads for the first season. And it was dark. We retained that darkness, and we were about to start breaking the second episode, and Ryan pulled me aside, and he had a conversation that I'll never forget, and it has impacted my writing since. He said, there is a joy that you have when you talk about being a queer person of color, when you talk about your, you know, being Afro-Latin, when you talk about your family, when you talk about growing up in the Bronx. He was like, I want to see that joy on the page. I want to feel that. That's what the audience is going to want as well. And everything shifted at that point. We just did a complete 180. And so the version of the show that you see now that, you know, truly honors family, and it's heartbreaking and it's complicated, but it's also wildly funny and it's really shady. Like that version of the show came out of that conversation with Ryan.
I personally, I mean, I love FX, but I would love to see the Pose on HBO. That would have happened, you know, a little bit more salacious, I'm guessing. We have another question here from Adam Brewer. He says, one of the really astounding things about Pose is how you all managed to tackle such serious subject matter like violence against trans women and AIDS while still finding so much beauty and hope in these characters' lives. How difficult is it to strike that perfect balance? Janet, we'll start with you.
You know, we're queer and trans people of color. And, you know, we've learned how to smile through the hardest of times, or we learned how to find joy in the hardest and most difficult of times. I think, and I'm probably speaking for both Steven and I, that, you know, to persevere is a part of our stuff, you know, and I think that there are great gifts and joys and exuberance and life and love and so much greatness that comes out of coming out of these communities. You know, for me, one of the first things I learned about myself was that I was a Black poor child in America before I even knew that I was trans. And so that frames the way that I live, the way that I operate, the way that I navigate the world. And I think, as Steven was saying, that great lesson that he got, which was, you know, when you talk about where you come from, when you talk about your people, you are proud. And I think it's that pride that genuinely shines through for us. I know when we, you know, when we think about the show and when we, you know, write the show, it's always like, we're never going to ignore the hard things and the hardships, right? Because the rewards, it makes the reward so much greater for these characters. You truly are invested. Like when you meet and hear Blanca for the first time in that pilot, you know, you see that she's like, you know, the self-sacrificing kind of stepchild in a way, who then sits alone in a room and hears that basically she gets a death sentence, you know, and like already there, you're just like, oh my God, am I going to enjoy this? Like, you're just like, but you feel for her immediately. And you see that her choice to choose to live, to make her dreams come true. Like that's the stuff that makes all of the magic in the world happen. And the reason why, you know, Black and brown people are still here persevering and smiling and twerking in the streets as they're protesting is because joy is an essential and vital part of our process of living. And so it is not for Steven and I, it comes very, it just comes out in the writing. Like even if someone's talking about, you know, bitch, I have AIDS, it's like the bitch stops, you know, smile, you know, be happy, buck up, girl. It's time to move on. You can't be sitting here crying all the time. So it's just a part of our lived experience. And so it just shows up naturally, at least I think.
Steven, you want to add?
She said it all. Once again, Janet Mock dropping knowledge. I'm over here taking notes.
You're just like, oh, okay. I mean, I totally love that, you know, joy is a part of that process, right? And I think Pose has brought joy to so many people, you know, with these stories. Oh, we have an anonymous attendee asking a question. Ooh, want to be anonymous, do you? Who were some of the people you looked up to when you were younger? Oh, Steven.
Well, for me, growing up, it was, you know, film and television characters. You know, outside of my mom, you know, Evelyn is a badass woman. And so, you know, outside of my mom, who really is the blueprint for me and really just set a really wonderful foundation for how I want to live my life, how I navigate it, how to have, you know, values and morals, etc. You know, like Optimus Prime, who I know is an animated character and was on a cartoon show that, you know, sold tons of toys for Hasbro. But the reality is, you know, as a little boy growing up in the projects in the Bronx, in the midst of the crack epidemic in the 80s, like there weren't a ton of people to look toward, you know? And so you didn't have a lot of models. And, you know, I found a salvation in film and in television. And so those made up characters meant the world to me. You know, so those were my earliest heroes, you know, and then as I got older, it was the men and women who were creating those characters and who were directing them. You know, it's not by chance that I'm doing the work that I'm doing right now. It was film became a universal language for me and my father, you know, where we had a very complicated relationship when I was growing up, and film and TV was healing, and it continues to be healing for me. So,
Janet?
Who did I look up to growing up? I guess growing up, probably be like people within my household. So it'd be like my grandmother Shelley, my grandmother Pearl, a Black woman and a Native Hawaiian woman who both grew up in housing projects, who raised their 6 children. So they were definitely pillars for me. I think if I looked to media, it'd be, you know, gratefully, I grew up in the age of great, you know, 90s Black cinema, meaning like when we had rom-coms, when we had dramas, we had comedies that had you falling on the floor, you know, so thinking about, you know, the Waiting to Exhales and like the great beauty of Whitney Houston and Angela Bassett, Whitney Houston and The Bodyguard, you know, all having those images as a young Black girl growing up in America, to see them glamorized and centered and vaunted on the screen meant something to me. It meant that I belong, that I deserve to be here. I turned to music, Janet Jackson, Lauryn Hill, Beyonce, Destiny's Child. They were everything to me, so I looked up to them. And in terms of probably the first drama that I watched growing up that meant everything to me was My So-Called Life. I watched it on reruns on MTV, I remember.
That show.
And, you know, Angela Chase was my everything, but then also just seeing the existence of Wilson Cruz's character, Ricky Vasquez, seeing this queer, gender non-conforming kid who's just taking up space in the girls' restroom, like with their friends, and it's normal. Like, it was like, oh my God, that's me. That's who I am, you know?
Yeah.
And so in that sense, those were kind of a kind of kaleidoscope of like possibility models for me growing up.
Yeah.
Ooh, and in the unscripted space, Miss Janet, let's not forget MTV's The Real World.
Oh my God! Wait, who? Which season?
Every. Let me tell you something. This was like right when quarantine happened. You know, and Janet and I were like, okay, we're having a conversation about an episode of this season, and we spent, I want to say, a solid like 7 hours on FaceTime just talking about The Real World, talking about who we like, who we don't like, favorite episodes, sending
oh my God,
YouTube.
Oh my, I will like, okay, I stopped at Vegas because I was all, okay, this is getting too much for me. But if you talk to me about Real World LA with Tammy, if you talk to me about Real World Hawaii with what went on with Ruthie, can we have a podcast, the 3 of us, talking about the Real World? And I actually have the first Real World on DVD, the Real World New York, the one where Heather B and Julie were best friends, and Heather B was walking with Julie, the dog Gouda, and then you know what I'm talking about? And then Heather B fell. I love me some Heather B. Oh my God. I could talk about that and My So-Called Life forever.
My favorite season of The Real World is season 6, Boston. And they had a Zoom reunion recently.
Wait, what?
I screen grabbed it. I was reposting it. Jason started following me, and you would think that it was like it was a lot. It was a moment for me.
My God.
Like,
Real World Boston was a mood because of her Genesisisms. Remember when she posted those all around the wall? And Camila. Oh God. Okay. Sorry, guys. We need to go back to these questions. So Amita asked, thank you both for creating such an amazing and important show. Knowing you created a series that would open people's eyes and perspectives about LGBTQ and trans POC, which has never been seen or done before on this level, was there ever a scene or storyline that you wrote that may be viewed as too risque or controversial for the audience? And what was the conversation to keep it or possibly lose it? Ooh, that's a good one.
I'll speak from my own experience. The most difficult thing that I think that we spent the most time breaking and writing would be episode 4 of the 2nd season, Never Knew Love Like This Before. I don't think we didn't take it lightly on the page, and we also didn't take it lightly as producers, realizing that we were basically putting a Black trans woman out of work by killing off her character. You know what I mean? And so that was a part of the decision making when we thought, who do we kill off, right? It informed our story because it had to. You know, we made our first headlines about the show were about the casting of these 5 women making history, that the 5 of them are going to be playing these roles on television. And so for us, I remember there were so many layers to the conversation, the decision-making process. And I remember as producers, Ryan saying, you know what, Angelica would be fine. I can write a role for her on, you know, the next season of American Horror Story. And that relieved us on, actually allowed us then to take our producer hats off and stop worrying about Angelica having work as an actor who we care about, and realize, oh, now we can just do justice to her character on the page and make sure we give her the work that truly allows her to shine and tell the best possible story.
Yeah.
Steve,
I think no, and this isn't, and that is the truth. I mean, the reality is that FX's whole campaign has been around how they are a fearless network, and they have never balked. You know, they've never come back and said, this is too much. And funny enough, and I think this is the power in having a friend, mentor, collaborator, ally in Ryan Murphy, which is, I can name multiple moments where Janet and I, really all of us in the room, have gone to the page and come back with a scene, and he's like, you could really ramp that up. You know, right now you're at a 5, you're maybe at a simmer, you can put it at a boil. And so that's always really surprising to realize that, you know, we can take as big a narrative swing as we want, and, you know, if the network is going to have a problem with it, we can always then have a conversation about why. But again, I really honestly, in this moment, I don't think there's been anything that we've written that they've come back and said, you can't do that.
I think maybe we have time for one more question, or maybe a couple more. Well, let's just do this until they tell me to stop. We have one. Which character is the biggest part of each of you? Oh,
Janet, can we answer it for each other?
Yes.
yeah. Oh, that would be a twist. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Steven. Yeah, Steven, answer for Janet. Janet, answer for Steven.
It's funny because we all have characters that we really love, and we you know, we'll track those characters' arcs when we're in the room. And I know the character that Janet has the deepest connection to is Angel, played by Miss India Moore. Angel, it's funny because now I'm thinking about how I want to frame this, because I know Janet, so I'm like, you know, I'm like, don't say that.
You might get in trouble.
You know, outside of both of them just being gorgeous, and having a voice and knowing how to use it, you know, there is a part of Angel that is, you know, really sensitive, and there's a childlike quality to Angel that I find really endearing. And she is someone who, she's so in touch with her feelings, you know, she's someone who I think on the surface people would say is very vulnerable, and the reality is that they're very strong. It's a strength that comes from resilience. It's a strength that comes from having lived a life, you know, from seeing the hard truths of the world, and in spite of all of that, not allowing that to shape the way that you then navigate life. You know, as Janet pointed out earlier, there's still a huge amount of joy. And, you know, I think the deepest connection for me between Janet and Angel as a character is that they're dreamers, and that dream is limitless, you know? And I love that in the ways that Janet has actually made those dreams come to fruition in her own life, that we're starting to see that happen for Angel on the show. You know, like that parallel that isn't by chance, that is intentional. Yeah, so those are the ways I think.
That was so poignant.
Yes.
I think Steven is definitely, and I go back and forth. I go back and forth between Pray Tell and Blanca for Steven. Definitely, it's Blanca, I think. But there's something about when you know Steven and he loves you, that he can be tough on you in the way that Pray Tell is at that microphone, right? It's like, did you write today? Did you write the pilot? Did you get it done? Oh, you didn't? Okay, I'm gonna keep telling you then. Well, you keep going on, girl. Keep strutting. I see you looking cute on that cover, but you ain't write the pilot yet. You didn't write that pilot, huh? Okay, but you know, keep going, girl. What's the scores? So that's Steven. But then I think more often, Steven is someone that I think a lot of people in his life go to for a great ear, an empathetic ear. And someone, when you're ready for the advice to be given to you, he's going to give you exactly what you need. And I think that that's something that we imbue in Blanca and her maternalness and how she takes care of a family. You know, Steven truly is the glue of this show for many different reasons. You know, the fact that he was the original kind of, you know, said that this is what I want to do. This is the show that I want to write. I'm writing it. I'm going to go out and pitch it. And get no after no. To get all those no's, after a while, most people would be like, yeah, okay, I'm good. That's going to go away. But he didn't. And without that, we would not be where we are now with this series. I mean, it's the same thing with Blanca. These people would not be able to survive and be able to eat and feed themselves and feed each other the love and nurturing that they need if she gave up. If she said that, okay, I'll just continue to be, you know, Electra's minion, right? Instead of saying, I deserve to be a mother. I deserve to be da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
Right? And so a lot of that is in Steven, and then like, you know, Blanca's signature, thank you. Someone down, that's very Steven too.
There goes Janet again. One up in me, talking about, you know, oh, it's so poignant, and then she gives a better answer. Thanks, girl. Thanks a lot.
That's why, but I think that's all the time we have. They're telling me we need to wrap up here soon. So I want to thank these two lovely people in front of me right now, Steven and Janet. You guys, I feel like I've been on the journey with you. And I love you guys, and I can't wait for Steven to open his bakery. And I can't wait to meet Janet's little puppy. But thank you guys so much. Thank you for Pose, and thank you for everyone who listened in and asked questions. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you for being a great host, you know.
Of course.
Love you, Janet.
Love you more.
Thank you, everyone.
It's someone, I have a frame here that's crooked, and it's been bothering me. I need to fix that.
Bye. Thank you.